Live from the BDN Studios, it's Bang and Dang.
That's awesome.
If you don't like that, then
You ain't black.
Before most Americans ever heard his name, David Glasgow Farragut, he already made a decision that would shape the entire outcome of the Civil War. Because when the moment came to choose between his home and his oath, he didn't hesitate. That same instinct to act instead of wait would carry him straight through the most heavily defended waters in the Confederacy. This is the man who forced his way past Forts Jackson and St. Philip, April of 62, took New Orleans, which was the South's largest city and most important port, in just a matter of days. Then 2 days later, with his fleet stalled under fire and one of his ships just blown out of the water by a mine at Mobile Bay, he made the call that decided the fight right there. So we're going to push forward anyway, drive straight through it, and break the last major Confederate hold on the Gulf. These moments didn't just win battles, they closed ports, split supply lines, helped turn the Mississippi River into a Union-controlled highway that cut the Confederacy in half. But none of that came out of nowhere. Farragut wasn't a late war hero who suddenly figured things out under pressure. He was built for these decisions. From the time he was a kid, literally raised in the Navy, trained to take responsibility early, shaped by decades of service where hesitation was the one thing he could not afford. So to understand how the Union managed to lock down the South's coastline and control its most important river, you got to start with the man who kept choosing to move forward when stopping would have been easier. Because old Farragut's story, it's not just about what he did during the war. It's about how a lifetime of experience turns into a handful of decisions that help decide it.
Oh, David Glasgow Farragut entered this very world as James Glasgow Farragut on the 5th of July, 1801. This happened at Campbell Station in what is now Maury County. You are not the father in Tennessee. Though the family was living near Knoxville in East Tennessee. They're on the frontier where life could turn rough in a hurry. Usually did. His daddy George was born Geordie Farragut Mesquita on September 29th, 1755. He was born in Ciutadella on the island of Minorca, which is at the time under British control, which pretty much everything was. He came from a seafaring family, made his way to the American colonies in 1776, anglicized his name, and joined the revolutionary cause. He served in the Continental Navy, rising to lieutenant while fighting the British at sea and privateering against the British shipping. After the old revolution, George settled for a time in the Carolinas, then moved to Tennessee around 1796. This is where he served in the local militia. He worked as a ferry operator along the Tennessee River, acted as a justice of the peace. Well, Farragut's mother, Elizabeth Shine, was born in 1765 in Dobbs County, North Carolina. This is an area now associated with Greene and Lenoir County. She was a Scottish-Irish background and had been widowed before marrying George around 1795. She became the mother of a large frontier family, with James as the youngest of at least 10 children. Oh, wow.
Well, she had the kind of toughness frontier life demanded, including stories of defending the home during Native American attacks. But that world changes fast. 1808, Elizabeth dies of yellow fever. That loss set the course for the rest of the boy's life. Meaning Farragut. A close family friend, naval officer David Porter, he stepped in and took responsibility for him. Porter had his own reason for doing it. George Farragut had cared for Porter's father during his final illness in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. Porter never forgot it. So the favor came back in a life-changing way. The young boy was brought into Porter's household. From that point forward, the future admiral was being raised not just by a guardian, but by a man who fully intended to shape him into a naval officer.
Nice.
About 1812, James Farragut formally took the name David in Porter's honor, becoming David Glasgow Farragut. And by then, his life was already moving hard towards the sea.
Ooh.
Porter wasted no time with him.
Damn right.
December 17th, 1810, when Farragut was just 9 years old, he secured the boy a warrant as a midshipman in the United States Navy, 9 years old.
Fantastic.
It was the beginning of his formal career, and it happened at just an age when most kids were still being taught basic reading and chores.
Well, even now, you can become a midshipman at like 12.
Farragut's education was not classroom-based in any modern sense. It was practical, harsh, and built around the old naval belief. Officers were made through responsibility, pressure, and exposure to danger. Ain't going to open a book. Aboard the frigate USS Essex, 1811, he learned seamanship, navigation, gunnery, and discipline while serving under Porter during coastal patrols off the United States.
Nice.
Porter didn't handle him gently either.
Nope. Why
Gave
would
him
you?
hard assignments, including responsibility over British prisoners held below decks in miserable heat. That was the whole point. It was to harden him early. Make command feel normal before he was old enough to even fully understand what most boys his age were being spared.
Damn right.
Then came the war.
After the United States declared war on Britain, June 18th, 1812, Farragut found himself in combat while still barely more than a child. Because on the 13th of August, 1812, serving aboard Essex, he took part in the capture of HMS Alert, his first combat action. Later that year, Essex rounded Cape Horn, entered the Pacific. This is where Porter launched one of the boldest American commerce raiding cruises of the whole entire war. Throughout 1813, Essex went after British whaling ships and commerce. They captured or destroyed more than a dozen vessels. This caused real disruption far from the main theaters people usually talk about when they cover the War of 1812. Farragut,
Who covers the War of 1812?
right. Farragut was right in the middle, learning the trade in the most unforgiving way possible. At just the ripe age of 12 years old, he was given one of the clearest signs yet that Porter trusted him. Because after the capture of the British bark Essex Jr., Farragut was placed in charge as a prize master. He was ordered to take the vessel into Valparaiso Harbor under Chilean neutrality rules, all while the enemy threats were still very real. Well, for a boy that young to be handed a captured ship and told, in effect, now go handle it, it says everything about how unusual his training had been and how quickly he had absorbed it. Well, the cruise did not end in glory, because on the 28th of March, 1814, off Valparaiso in Chile, Essex was attacked by the British frigates HMS Phoebe and HMS Cherub in what became the Battle of Valparaiso. The British had the advantage, and the fight turned into a punishing defeat. Farragut was wounded in the action, but lived. Afterward, he helped the ship's surgeon care for the wounded and prisoners ashore, which gave him another kind of wartime education. This is one that had nothing to do with sails or guns, and everything to do with what combat actually did to men once the smoke cleared. So by the time most boys his age had never left home, Farragut had already lost his mother, been taken into the household of one of the Navy's toughest officers, entered service as a child, crossed Cape Horn, fought in a battle, commanded a captured ship, wounded under fire, and he also watched a hard campaign end in defeat. That was how his naval life began. It explains a lot about the officer he would become later, because from the very start, David Farragut was raised in a world where duty came early and danger often, and nobody had much patience for hesitation, especially back then.
Well, when the War of 1812 finally wound down, and ironically 1815, Farragut was just still a teenager. But he already had more real naval experience than many officers twice his age.
Right.
And that set the tone for everything that came next. Instead of slowing down, his career moved right into the kind of work the U.S. Navy found itself doing in peacetime. Less about fleet battles and more about protecting American commerce. By 1820, he had served with the Mediterranean Squadron, gaining further experience overseas. Not long after that, he was assigned to one of the most demanded and frustrated jobs in the Navy at the time, which was the West Indies Squadron, often called the Mosquito Fleet. Oh, wasn't glamorous. Meant chasing pirates through the Caribbean, navigating shallow coastal waters around Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Bahamas. Plus, dealing with an enemy that didn't fight in formation or follow any rules, right? Piracy had surged in the region after the Latin American Wars of Independence, with former privateers turning to outright raiding. The U.S. government, they decided it had to be stopped, damn it.
They got to.
1822, under the command of Commodore David Porter, same man who had raised them, the squadron was organized to hunt these groups down, and Farragut became part of that effort as a past midshipman. Work was steady, exhausting, often thankless, involving convoy escorts, reconnaissance, sudden pursuits of small, fast pirate vessels that could disappear into shallow waters. That's where the larger ships dare not go. Back to my home, they dare not go. But it forced Farragut to sharpen his seamanship in ways that open ocean service never could. 1823, at just 22 years old, he received his first independent command, the schooner USS Ferret, a small vessel designed exactly for this kind of work. It wasn't a large or prestigious command, but it was his. This is my rifle, this is my gun. And it meant responsibility for everything. Crew, ship, mission, and outcomes.
Damn right it did. Through the year of 1824, he carried out...
Now he's responsible for people's lives.
Right. Through 1824, he carried out anti-piracy controls, transporting Marines, scouting suspected hideouts, supporting operations, and over time broke the back of organized piracy in the region. While specific individual engagements tied directly to Farragut are not always recorded in detail, but the overall results were clear. The squadron captured or destroyed numerous pirate vessels. They freed captives, and they also restored a measure of security to the United States
Damn right.
of America.
You guys can proceed unmolested.
For Farragut, it reinforced something that would stick with them for life. A strong dislike for piracy and a belief that the Navy's role was not just war, but protection of commerce and order at sea. I'm your captain now. When the Farragut was decommissioned in 1824, he returned to the United States. And in 1825, he passed his examination for lieutenant.
Look at that.
He earned promotion that very August.
Lieutenant David Farragut.
And what would that promotion do to him? Well, it marked his transition from a young officer shaped by experience into one expected to lead consistently. He's like, all right, boy, now this... Over the next 2 decades, Farragut served in a variety of assignments. It didn't always make headlines, but it built the kind of steady, reliable career that the Navy valued. He handled ordnance duties. He took part in court-martials. Spent time at naval yards along the East Coast, including earlier service as executive officer of the receiving ship Pennsylvania at Norfolk Navy Yard. This is where he dealt with the administrative side of naval life, logistics, personnel, and the kind of work that keeps a Navy functioning, even when no one was firing a shot. Then came the Mexican-American War. March 1847, Farragut was given command of the sloop of war, USS Saratoga. This is a 22-gun vessel assigned to operations in the Gulf of America.
Right.
His mission, well, simple. It was just a part of a broader strategy under Commodore Matthew Perry.
Damn.
He overdosed in a hot tub.
Right.
His mission was part of a broader strategy under Commodore Matthew Perry. Well, all you had to do was isolate Mexican ports and support amphibious operations. That's it, bud. Simple.
By April 30th, 1847, Saratoga was on station off of Tuxpan. It's a fortified port north of Veracruz. Farragut's job was to enforce the blockade, intercept vessels, support operations along the coast. In practice, it meant long stretches of routine patrol work, watching for movement, seizing contraband ships, and maintaining pressure on the port. The major fighting at Veracruz had already taken place before his arrival, and that clearly bothered him. He wanted some action, damn it. He wanted something decisive, and instead found himself in a role that is important strategically, but it didn't offer much opportunity for distinction. He wanted his name out there.
Right.
Conditions made it even worse. The Gulf climate was brutal. It was hot. There was rampant disease. Limited fresh supplies, wearing down crews. Late 1847, yellow fever broke out aboard Saratoga, infecting 99 sailors and killing 4 of them.
Damn.
Even with that, though, he stayed on duty, returning to blockade operations off Tuxpan on September 1st. Continued there for another 2 months. By December, frustrated with the lack of what he considered meaningful engagement and the toll on his crew, he requested some relief.
Right, I'm fucking done.
Described the assignment as lacking honorable duties that matched his experience. He said, I'm better than this. His command ended when Saratoga returned to New York February 19th, 1848, after the war's conclusion under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Tell that to Sterling Price, because that guy didn't care.
Right.
The Mexican-American War did not make Farragut famous, but it did refine his understanding of blockades, coastal operations, and the realities of sustained naval pressure. Lessons that are going to matter a great deal in a couple of years here. In the years that followed, he continued to build his career through steady assignments rather than dramatic moments.
Ooh, then 1854 rolls around. He receives one of the most important peacetime roles of his life. He's sent to Cali to establish and command the new naval yard at Mare Island. He arrived there on 16th September as his first commandment. At that time, Mare Island was little more than a concept, a remote location that needed to be turned into a functioning naval facility. And over the next 5 years, Farragut did just that. He oversaw its development, organized construction, managed resources, and building it into a key base for ship repair and maintenance on the West Coast. It was difficult, made harder by distance from established supply lines, limited funding, but showed another side of old Farragut. Not just a fighting officer, but a capable administrator who could take something from the ground up and make it work. 1855, while serving at Mare Island, he was promoted captain, the highest rank available in the United States Navy at that time.
Right.
This is a recognition.
He's about to break all these records. He's going to have a rank created just for him.
Damn right. This is a recognition of decades of steady service, competence, and accumulated experience. And by 1860, with tensions rising between the North and the South, Farragut took command of the sloop USS Brooklyn in the Gulf of America, conducting patrols and maintaining readiness in increasingly uncertain waters. He had spent nearly his entire life in the Navy.
Yeah, this dude's already
Right.
59 years old, dude.
Rising from a 9-year-old midshipman to one of the most experienced captains, and without even knowing it yet, he was about to step into the moment that would define his entire legacy. By the time succession became a reality in early 1861, David Glasgow Farragut, he found himself in a position that would have torn a lot of men apart.
Oh, it did.
He had been born in Tennessee, spent much of his adult life in Norfolk, Virginia, married into a Southern family, his home, his connections, much of his personal life tied to the South. But his identity, the thing that had shaped him since he was 9, was tied to the United States Navy.
It's called loyalty, bitches.
He'd taken his oath as a midshipman on December 17th, 1810. And after more than 50 years of service under that very flag, he saw secession not as a political disagreement, but as a direct challenge to the country he had sworn to serve.
Damn right. Somebody's got a fucking brain in their head, don't they?
When Virginia voted to succeed on April 17th, 1861, the pressure around him in Norfolk turned immediate and real. Union officers were expected to choose sides. For someone in Farragut's position, there was plenty of people who assumed they already knew what his answer would be. And guess what? They were wrong.
April 18th, very next day, Farragut made his decision clear. He left Norfolk with his family and moved north to Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. Hastings-on-Hudson, huh?
Hey.
Putting distance between himself and a city that was rapidly becoming Confederate territory. Rapidly, it already is. That decision cost him relationships, connections, and any comfortable position he might have had in the South. But it did settle the one question that mattered. He was staying with the Union. Even then, it didn't immediately reward him either. In Washington, as it was with many other people that were from the South that stayed with the Union, there was some hesitation. Farragut's Southern birth, his years in Virginia, his family ties all made some officials a little uneasy about giving him a major command at that very moment when loyalty was the most sensitive issue in the Navy. So for a time, he sat in a kind of professional limbo. He was experienced, capable, but he wasn't trusted with a decisive role, even though he's the best guy you got. But that all changed December 21st, 1861, when he met with Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Gustavus Fox. Well, Fox needed someone aggressive, someone experienced, and someone willing to take some risks. Farragut, he fit that description to a T. He was given command of the West Gulf Blockading Squadron.
Perfect.
Pretty important.
Right. Well, that assignment came with a clear objective. We need New Orleans, and we need it now. That was not just another target. New Orleans was the Confederacy's largest city, its most important port, and the gateway to the Mississippi.
Some might say it's in port and
more than half of the South's exports, especially cotton, moved through that city. If it fell, the old Rebs would lose a critical economic lifeline and a major piece of its connection to the outside world. The problem? Getting to it. Mississippi River below New Orleans was guarded by 2 major Confederate forts, Fort Jackson, Fort St. Philip. Their position to control that river. There were also obstacles placed in the water. Chains stretched across the river.
what would that do?
Fire rafts and supporting naval forces. On paper, it looked like the kind of defensive setup that should stop a fleet cold in their tracks. Farragut did not plan to sit outside and bombard it into submission forever. By late February 1862, he had assembled his force at Ship Island, which is in Mississippi. He built a fleet of 17 warships, including his flagship USS Hartford, along with screw sloops like Pensacola, Mississippi, Brooklyn, and Richmond, supported by gunboats and a separate mortar flotilla of 20 schooners under his adopted brother, David Dixon Porter.
Adopted father, more like.
Right. Starting on the 18th of April, 1862, Porter's mortars.
Porter's mortars.
Porter's mortar fleet began bombarding the forts, firing more than 16,000 shells over a course of 6 days. Loud, constant, and impressive, but it did not break the forts the way many had hoped. The old Rebs' defenses, built with thick earthworks, absorbed much of the punishment. Farragut understood that waiting for the forts to collapse could drag on indefinitely. Indefinitely. And time was not on the Union side. So, guess what he did? He made a decision that defined the operation. Instead of waiting, like McClellan or any other Union general would have done on land, he would run the fleet past the forts. On the night of April 24th, 1862, Farragut put the plan in motion. He divided the fleet into 3 sections and began moving upriver under the cover of darkness. The ships had to pass directly into the guns of the forts while dealing with fire rafts drifting downriver. Rebel gunfire and the threat of enemy vessels, including the ironclad ram, CSS Manassas.
All the Manassas.
Were all there, standing in his way. Could he do it? I'm sure he could. Will he do it? I bet he will.
As you might imagine, it was chaotic, dangerous, and exactly the kind of situation where hesitation would get ships destroyed, men killed, and the momentum lost. But instead, the momentum carried him through.
Oh.
By dawn, 13 U.S. ships had successfully passed the forts. Some were damaged. The USS Varuna, it was lost after a fierce fight with Confederate ships. But the main fleet was through, and that changed everything.
I mean, you're bound to lose one or two.
Right. With the forts effectively bypassed, New Orleans suddenly exposed. Farragut pushed upriver, reached the city April 25th. He demanded its surrender from Mayor John T. Monroe, who refused at first. But the situation was already out of his hands. Confederate forces, they couldn't stop the fleet. Several ships were destroyed. General Mansfield Laval's troops, they withdrew. Over the next few days, with no real way to defend the city, New Orleans fell under Union control by April 28th, and the forts themselves surrendered shortly after.
There it is.
Farragut's men raised the United States flag over the city, facing hostile crowds, and secured control of a place with around 168,000 residents.
Yeah, these guys are as far south as you can get. Florida didn't count.
The significance of that moment, hard to overstate. The Confederacy lost its largest city. It's the most important port early in the war. The Mississippi, at least in the lower stretches, was now open to Union movement, and soon to be all of it. Vicksburg coming around the corner. All of it had been achieved not by slowly battering down defenses, but by taking a calculated risk and driving straight through them.
Just fucking go.
That decision, more than anything else, showed exactly what kind of commander old David Farragut had become.
With New Orleans secured by late April of 1862, Farragut, he didn't stand still. No.
He's in the water.
This is because the larger objective had always been to control all of the Mississippi. And that meant pushing north into a territory that was still very much in Confederate hands. On the 9th of May, 1862, his fleet reached Baton Rouge, which was taken without even resistance. And by May 12th, he had moved on to Natchez, which also fell without a fight. But that easy progress came to a stop when he got to Vicksburg on the 18th of May. Unlike the cities of the South, Vicksburg was built for defense.
Sure was, man. If you ever seen that river where Vicksburg is, like snakes,
Right.
it's perfect.
The city sat on high bluffs overlooking a shot bend in the river. The old rebel artillery position there could fire down onto any ship trying to pass. Farragut demanded the city surrender, but Confederate Commander Milton Smith refused, and that forced him into a situation where naval power alone just quite
Gotta bring in the infantry, boys.
Without sufficient Union ground forces to take the high ground, Farragut turned to bombardment. Starting May 23rd, Commander David Dixon Porter's mortar flotilla opened fire, sending shells into the city and its defenses over the course of weeks. The problem? Well, it was the same one he had seen at Fort Jackson and Fort Phillip.
With the Saint.
Right. Earthworks and elevation made the bombardment far less effective than expected. The Confederate guns remained in place, and the city held for now. Farragut knew he could not stay there indefinitely, so on the night of the 28th of June, 1862, he made another bold move. He ordered part of his fleet to run past the batteries under cover of darkness. 7 of his wooden warships, including the flagship USS Hartford, pushed through heavy fire, taking damage and casualties, but they made it through. That maneuver allowed Farragut to link up briefly with the Union Mississippi River flotilla operating from the north under Flag Officer Charles Davis. This created the appearance, at least for a moment, of Union naval control over a large stretch of the river. And for you guys.
But appearances don't equal control. Low water levels, limited movement, without any strong army support. Farragut couldn't hold the position for very long. Then July 15th, the situation became even more complicated when the Confederate ironclad CSS Arkansas came down the Yazoo, and attacked Union vessels, damaging several ships before taking refuge under the protection of Vicksburg's guns. Farragut tried to eliminate the threat, even making another run past the batteries and coordinated with vessels like the USS Essex. But the Arkansas, despite mechanical issues, survived the encounter and remained a problem. By late July 1862, with the fallen river levels, limited supplies, no realistic way to take Vicksburg without coordinated army action, Farragut had to pull his fleet back downriver. Wasn't a defeat in the traditional sense, but it was clear that the limits of naval power when operating alone was pretty hard when you got bluffs and guns and all that shit. But pressure applied wasn't wasted.
Oh, it wasn't.
It also forced the Confederates to stay alert, tied down resources, and kept the river contested. Farragut's role in the Mississippi campaign didn't end there either. March of 63, Union forces renewed efforts to gain control of the river. He moved against another stronghold, which was Port Hudson, Louisiana. March 14th, he again ordered his ships to run past heavily fortified Confederate batteries. Like, hey, it worked twice.
Yep.
This time, the cost was higher, though. USS Mississippi ran aground under fire and had to be destroyed to prevent capture. But several Farragut ships did make it through, allowing them to operate above Port Hudson and coordinate with Union forces coming downriver. Over the next few months, as Major General Nathaniel Banks' army laid siege to Port Hudson beginning May 22nd, Farragut's ships supported operations from the river, obviously. Well, they fucking walked on land.
Right.
And they provided bombardment and maintained pressure on the Confederate defenses.
Fuck yeah, they did. Vicksburg finally fell to Union forces on a grant, and just 5 days later, July 9th, Port Hudson. Done. With those two strongholds gone, the Mississippi was firmly in Union hands, from its source to the Gulf.
All the way down, baby.
That achievement effectively split the Confederacy in two, cutting off Texas and Arkansas and parts of Louisiana from the rest of the South. Farragut's operation had not single-handedly taken Vicksburg or Port Hudson, but they did play a critical role in the larger campaign. They applied constant pressure, disrupting Confederate movements, helping make it possible for Union armies to finish the job. About mid-1863, with the war looking in the Union's favor, the river that had once been a Confederate lifeline had become a Union-controlled artery. And Farragut had been at the center of making that happen.
For you.
By the summer of 1864, Farragut had already helped secure the Mississippi and cripple Confederate control along the Gulf. But there's still one major hole in the Union blockade, and you guessed it, Mobile Bay, Alabama. It was the Confederates' last significant port of the Gulf, still open to the blockade runners. And as long as it remained in Southern hands, supplies and trade could still slip through. The defenses guarding it was serious.
Yeah, they didn't have nowhere else to guard.
Right. At the entrance to the bay stood Fort Morgan on Mobile Point and Fort Gaines on Dauphin Island, backed by heavy artillery. The waters between them were seeded with contact mines, then called torpedoes. And inside the bay sat a small but dangerous Confederate naval force led by ironclad ram CSS Tennessee. It was a volunteer.
Right. Farragut understood right away that this would not be a slow siege. If Mobile Bay was going to fall, it would have to be forced. His fleet was assembled for exactly that kind of job, though. He brought 18 major vessels into the operation, including his flagship, Hartford, 13 additional wooden warships, and 4 ironclad monitors, the Tecumseh, the Manhattan, the Winnebago, and the Chickasaw, which were placed at the front to absorb the worst of the fire, clearly. Supporting operations were underway on land as well. Major General Gordon Granger's forces capturing Dauphin Island August 3rd, 1864, and beginning the reduction of Fort Gaines, but the decisive moment was going to happen on the water. Dawn, August 5th, moved in. Dawn, August 5th, Farragut's fleet, they moved in. The ships advanced in pairs, lashed together so that if one was disabled, the other could keep going, and the monitors led the way toward Fort Morgan's guns. Not long into the advance, the worst-case scenario hit. About 8:30 in the morning, the lead monitor, USS Tecumseh, struck a mine and sank almost immediately, taking 94 of her 114 crewmen down with her. The shock of that loss rippled through the line. The wooden ships behind her began to slow and veer away, trying to avoid the same fate.
Yeah, they're like, fuck, we're wood, the guys.
Right.
Shit.
And for a moment, the entire attack threatened to stall right there under the guns of the fort. Oh, Farragut, he could see exactly what was happening. Positioned high in the rigging of the USS Hartford, this is his famous quote that he's known for. He's in the rigging of the USS Hartford, lashed in place so he could see over the smoke. He understood that hesitation in that moment would be more dangerous than the mines themselves. Yeah, sitting ducks here, guys. Right. If the fleet stopped or turned back, it would sit exposed to concentrated fire from the forts and the Confederate ships waiting inside the bay. So guess what? He made the call that defined his career, his life, and the battle, and what he's known for now.
Oh, my goodness. He ordered the fleet forward, and the command later remembered in various forms as, "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead!" However, it was phrased in the moment. The meaning was clear. Keep moving. Trust speed and momentum over caution. The fleet responded. Ships pushed forward through the minefield. Ships pushed forward through the minefield. Some taking risks that could have ended them, but most made it through.
For them.
Hartford herself grounded briefly, but was worked free. And once inside the bay, the fight shifted from surviving to approach to destroying the Confederate force. The smaller Confederate gunboats, Selma, Morgan, and Gaines, were quickly dealt with, either captured or driven ashore, leaving the ironclad Tennessee as the main threat. Under Admiral Franklin Buchanan, Tennessee attempted to ram and engage the Union ships, but it was outmatched. Farragut's fleet closed in from multiple directions with ironclad monitors hammering it with heavy Dahlgren guns, while the wooden ships added broadsides. Buchanan was wounded early in the fight. Command went to Captain James Johnston. Tennessee took severe damage. Its steering crippled, smokestack destroyed. No ability to maneuver or effectively fight back. Johnston surrendered around 10 a.m. in the morning.
Better, bud.
10 a.m. in the morning. Around 10 a.m. And by noon, the naval battle was effectively over. Mobile Bay, Union hands. Fort Morgan, held out until August 23rd before finally surrendering after sustained bombardment and isolation. The Bluecoats' losses in the battle, 170 murdered and wounded, compared to relatively light Confederate naval casualties. But the strategic result mattered far more than the numbers.
Who cares? Some people died that day.
Right. What difference does it make?
With Mobile Bay closed, the Confederacy lost its last major Gulf port, and blockade runners had nowhere left to go on the coastline. And the South's ability to import supplies and export goods was reduced even further. For Farragut, it was the defining moment of his career. His decision to push through the minefield instead of hesitating under fire showed exactly the kind of commander he had become over decades of service, and exactly the ones that he got hired for. And he understood that in certain moments, the greater risk was standing still. The victory at Mobile Bay effectively ended the large-scale Confederate naval operations in the Gulf, tightened the Union's grip on the region as the war entered its final phase. With the war effectively decided by 1865 and the Confederacy collapsing, Farragut moved into the final phase of his career, not as a rising commander, but as the most recognized naval officer in the United States.
Damn right.
His wartime record had already set him apart. In July of 1866, Congress created a new rank in the Navy specifically for him, full admiral, making him the first officer in United States history to hold that title. It was a direct acknowledgement of what he'd done during the war, from Nolens to Mobile Bay, and it placed him at the very top of the naval hierarchy at a time when the United States was beginning to think about its role beyond its own borders. Yeah, now they're like, we just did this.
Right.
We got these new ironclads. What other countries can we meddle in?
The
The following year, 1867, Farragut took command of the European Squadron, which was his final active sea assignment, and he had the steam frigate USS Franklin as his flagship there.
Damn right he did.
This wasn't a combat mission, though. The war's over. The purpose of the cruise was diplomatic, to show the flag, rebuild international relationships.
Right, you got to strut around, buddy.
Right. And he present the United States as stable and respected power after the conflict. Farragut departed New York June of 67 and arrived in European waters later that summer, to begin a long tour that would carry him across major ports and capitals. The squadron visited places like Cherbourg in France, St. Petersburg in Russia, where Farragut and his officers were received with formal honors by all these peoples.
Wow.
European leaders treated him not just as a naval officer, but as a symbol of American victory and resilience.
Look at that.
And the receptions reflected that. He met with monarchs, attended official functions, and hosted events aboard Franklin, all of which reinforced his status on an international stage.
The cruise.
He had to go. It was basically a FU tour to everybody that was thinking about back in the Confederacy.
The cruise lasted until 1868, later in that year, when the squadron was relieved and Farragut returned to New York on the 10th of November. It has been a successful mission in terms of diplomacy, with no incidents and a steady projection of American presence abroad. After returning to the U.S., Farragut remained on active duty as a senior officer in the Navy. But his role shifted away from sea command into administrative and ceremonial responsibilities. He had spent nearly his entire life on the water, and by late 1860s, the physical toll of that career was catching up with him. Years of service in difficult climates, especially along the Gulf Coast. Dude, that probably was the coldest and hottest he's ever been in his life.
Right.
Jeez. Especially along the Gulf Coast during the Civil War. He added, this had a major effect on his health, and by his late 60s, he was no longer the same man who stood in the rigging at the Mobile Bay. This dude is broke down. All that salt, you think that probably dries him out, right? Dried out, withered man. 1869, he undertook what would be his final official duty. He traveled to Portsmouth in New Hampshire. He wanted to take part in a memorial ceremony for George Peabody, a prominent American philanthropist whose death had drawn national attention. Around this very time, his health began to decline. More noticeably, he had periods of serious illness that left him weak. Despite that, he remained on active duty, still holding his position as his Navy's highest ranking officer. In the summer of 1870, seeking relief from the heat, Farragut traveled to Portsmouth once again. He stayed near Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and on August 14th, 1870, at the ripe age of 69, he suffered a fatal heart attack. In death, the recognition of his service was immediate and national in scale. His frail body was transported by funeral train to New York City, where services were held at Trinity Church. The procession that followed, 10,000 soldiers, sailors, civilians, led by President Ulysses S. Grant, along with other prominent figures. A clear sign of respect Farragut commanded across the country. At the request of his wife, Virginia, sweet Virginia, he was buried not in Arlington, but in a woodlawn cemetery in Bronx. This is a family plot that became its first internment. By the time of his death, Farragut had spent nearly 60 years, and so it must be just his wife and him, and not his whole family.
Well, I'm assuming they made the plot for their family, right? But he was the first one to die, clearly.
Right, but not like his
peeps.
mom, dad, and all those guys. By the time of his death, Farragut had spent 60 years in naval service, rising from a 9-year-old midshipman to the first full admiral in American history. And his career had stretched from the age of sail through the early era of steam.
Right.
From the War of 1812 to the end of the Civil War. This is a great span that covers some of the most important transformations in our young country's Navy would ever go through. Damn.
Right.
Dude, 60 years and he was 69. 60 years. Holy fuck.
Dude was a veteran and he was only 19.
I put in my 30 years, boys. He looked like he was 50, bro.
Right. By the time old Farragut's career was looked at as a whole, it was clear he had done more than just win a few major battles. He had helped define what the United States Navy would become and did become. During the war, Congress formally recognized his actions more than once, passing a joint resolution July 11, 1862, formally thanking him and the officers and men under his command for the capture of New Orleans. Then again, for his role at Mobile Bay, September 12, 1866, they did that. But beyond those, his promotions told the real story. July 16, 1862, he became the first rear admiral in U.S. Navy history, a rank created in response to what he had accomplished.
Right.
And then, December 21st, 1864, he was promoted to vice admiral. And finally, the first full admiral the Navy had ever had, July 25th, 1866. Those weren't routine promotions based on time served either. They were direct responses to results in the field. They reflected how much, I was just sitting here in the service for 40 years doing nothing. Right. And they reflected just how much his actions had shifted the balance of the war at sea. His approach to naval warfare stood out just as much as the outcomes themselves. Farragut, he didn't believe in sitting back and slowly wearing down defenses if there was a way to break through them. New Orleans, we already know what he did there. Ran past Forts Jackson and St. Philip's. And that choice opened up the river and took the Confederacy's largest city in a matter of days. Did the same thing at Mobile Bay. Pushed his fleet through a mine channel under heavy fire instead of hesitating. Once inside that bay, he finally destroyed the Confederate naval force and sealed the port for good.
In both cases, the pattern was the same. Accept calculated risk, maintain momentum, and force a decision before the enemy could even fully react. That was the way of thinking, using speed, aggression, positioning instead of relying purely on firepower, influenced how the Navy would approach similar problems going forward, especially in riverine and coastal operations. His impact did not stop with tactics, no. His name and rep would become part of the Navy's identity. Monuments were built in his honor, including a statue in Madison Square Park in New York that was unveiled on May 22, 1881, and another in Washington, D.C. at Farragut Square in 1880, both serving as public reminders of his role in preserving the Union. The Navy itself carried his name forward, commissioning multiple ships called USS Farragut over the years, starting with the torpedo boat, 1899, continuing on through modern destroyers like the USS Farragut DDG-99, commissioned June 10th, 2006. Towns, squares, memorials all across the country took his name, tying his legacy to both naval history and the broader national memory of the Civil War. At that very same time, not every view of Farragut has been entirely one-sided, as never is. From the Confederate perspective during and after the war, he was often seen as a traitor, obviously, a Southern-born officer who chose the Bluecoats over his home region. That criticism was especially strong after the fall of New Orleans.
How could you do that to us?
Right, and the closing of Mobile Bay, both of which struck directly at the South's ability to sustain itself. In modern discussions, there also has been some examination of the broader impact of Union naval strategy, including blockades and port seizures, which caused economic hardship for civilians in the South. Though those critiques tend to focus more on their overall strategy than on Farragut personally.
Well, right.
His own views had another layer to that conversation.
Because guess what? Before the war, census records show that he was connected to slaveholding through his household in Norfolk.
I mean, what are you going to do?
So there's very little detailed evidence about his personal stance on slavery itself. But it's clear that his decision in 1861 was driven by his sense of duty to the Union. Well, we also know he saw secession as illegal and believed his oath required him to oppose it. And that belief guided everything that followed. In the end, most historical assessments come back to the same conclusion. He was a decisive, aggressive commander whose actions had real strategic consequences. His capture of New Orleans cut off the Confederacy's largest port for the 800th time. His operations along the Mississippi supported the eventual fall of Vicksburg and the splitting of the South, and his victory at Mobile Bay closed the last major Gulf outlet. Taken together, those actions played a major role in the tightening the Union grip on the Confederacy and accelerated the war towards its conclusion. He didn't win the war by himself, but the Navy's success in controlling the rivers and the coastline depended heavily on the kind of leadership he provided. And by the time that very war ended, he had become not just a successful officer, but the standard that future naval commanders would be measured against. You're no David Farragut.
Right.
He had never had the makings of an Admiral athlete, right?
Right.
In the end, Farragut's story comes down to something pretty simple. When the moment came and everything was on the line, he didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look for a safer option.
He didn't. He's probably one of the few Union generals, land or water, to just take it straight forward, baby.
Him and Grant, basically, right?
And Grant Sherman.
Yeah, well, Sherman was just fucking everything up, though. I mean, Sheridan tried too, but he pushed forward, and that's how New Orleans, that's how New Orleans fell. That's how Mobile Bay was taken. That's how the Union tightened its grip on the South. But not because the situation was easy, but because he made the harder decision when it mattered most. When you take a step back and look at it all, that's what really set him apart. Whole lifetime of experience that came down to a handful of moments where he chose to act. And in doing just that, he helped decide the whole course of the war and maybe even the whole course of the country's history.
Right. We're here right now because of that. Well, we probably still would be, but.
Well, maybe. Well, David Farragut. All right, look at that.
Think about it. If the Confederate actually won the war, how long would it have been a country? I don't think it would. I think we would have had another civil war in like the 80s of the 1800s.
Probably.
And then Union would have won that one.
And definitely wouldn't have gone into the 1900s.
No.
Where modern shit was, no. The South would have been annihilated.
There's no way. Because they would want to be a powerful country in the world, but no powerful countries had slaves.
Right.
So it just wouldn't work out.
What was Lincoln? If you guys remember, we did Lincoln's 4 parts on that bastard.
Yep.
His view was just that slavery would end itself eventually down the line.
It would have.
But then they forced hands and they threw some hands. Dave Farragut, all right, good guy. Cool. Good for him.
Yeah, finally.
He
real good guy.
He honestly might be the only, like,
besides what's his face?
non-piece of shit that we've covered.
No, besides what's his face?
From the beginning.
Right. Right.
Who?
What was a really good one? He had a really good life.
I mean,
Juba Early?
George Thomas was decent. Juba Early was not.
No.
Yeah, George Thomas was decent.
Yes.
That's about it. Everybody else had issues and didn't want to follow directions and had big chips on their shoulders and all that shit. This guy was like 9 years old. He didn't even 9 years old.
9 years old. A man.
Right, man. Fucking had Popeye arms and shit. Now, it's David Farragut next week. We'll be back for some more Confederate allies. Hopefully somebody decent. Somebody good. Good and Confederates don't go hand in hand, do they?
Right.
At least with their generals. Yeah, so you guys know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe, give us a review.
Maybe we'll dig into some, if there's any famous, like, soldiers or something. Soldier stories. We get into those if we can find some credible ones.
Oh, I'm sure there's plenty of actual regular
Diaries.
soldiers.
Maybe we'll read some diaries here in the next episode.
Oh, jeez, that's all we need.
A handful of diaries.
That's all we need. If you guys ever want to hear,
Dear Belinda.
if you guys ever want to hear Dang talking to a southern accent for 40 minutes, then that's the way to go. That's for sure. Yeah. Anyway, you never know. We might even do it. So tune in next week to see. We'll see you then. We're Mother Music.